So this afternoon we are in for a treat. My good friend, and I know many of your good friend, Rosemarie Garland-Thomson, is going to talk to us about Foundling wheels. Rosemarie Garland-Thomson is a professor emerita of English and bioethics at Emory University. Her expertise is in disability bioethics, critical disability studies, and health humanities. She brings disability culture, ethics, and justice to a broad range of institutions and communities. She's a Hastings Center Fellow and Senior Advisor, a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar, and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's co-editor of About Us, essays from the New York Times about disability by people with disabilities, and author of Staring, How We Look, as well as several other books that I commend to you. So please help me in welcoming Rosemarie Garland-Thomson.
Thank you, Devin, for that gracious introduction. Thank you to ITD and the entire apparatus of leadership and membership. I'm delighted to be here. This is my second ITD, and I am absolutely committed to the enterprise and delighted to be involved and to be able to contribute. So the title of my talk, as Devin suggested, is Foundling Wheels, and I've messed with the subtitle quite a bit. I'm calling it now An Ethics of Care as Holding, and it's a very ambitious and also introductory kind of project. I'm just beginning this. I'm trying to try it out, if you will, on you a little bit, so I'd be very grateful for any kind of feedback that you might have about the content as well as the form. So those of us who work in bioethics, in disability studies, in disability theology, try to create as inclusive an environment as we possibly can. So I am attempting here to create as accessible a communication environment as I might try to do. And so this requires several things. One of the things we'll begin with is description. Another thing, a description of all kinds, so I will try to do as much description as I can. I will read the text that I have on the screen except for the captions for the images. I use a lot of images because I try to present as many forms and formats of the information that I am putting forward as I possibly can. This creates a kind of a mess. And so since this project is not very finished, it's just beginning, if you will tolerate the messiness of this, I would be very grateful for that, and I'm also very grateful for any kind of feedback you have about both the form and the content of what I am able to present here to you. So I will begin with my description, and I have a visual version of my description, which is an access practice, which acknowledges that the community of viewers here, the audience, might not all be accessing the presentation or the presenter visually. So that's the purpose of description. So Rosemarie Garland-Thomson, me, pictured here, and I have a photograph here of myself, which is a lot better looking than I am, I can tell you. That's because you pay for it. Is a pale-skinned, middle-aged woman with silver chin-length straight hair, reddish lipstick, wearing round black glasses frames, and a black jacket. She, or I in this case, am pictured here in a professional headshot taken in the living room of my apartment in San Francisco. But I do want to add to that description, because I am here in person for you, I want to add that I have a significant upper body mobility disability, which gives me arms that are both asymmetrical and unusual. When I am presenting on a video, that element of myself is muted because it's not seen in the way that we present ourselves on these screens. But for here now, for you in person, this is evident, and so I wanted to include that in my description. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of some of the ambitious points that I'm going to make, or topics that I'm going to cover here. I'm going to talk about a concept at the beginning called disability biodiversity conservation, which is a concept that I have put forward in a published article. I'll talk a little bit about that as a grounding principle or concept for my work. I'll also talk about the cultural and moral work of representation, which is the disciplinary area that the knowledge sector, if you will, that I work in as an English teacher, which is, and a bioethicist. So those are my areas. I will talk about what I call the moral work of accessible technologies. And then my actual topic here that I get to as the fourth thing is the idea of a Foundling wheel, and I'll talk a little bit about that, which is something I'm calling a ramp to life. And then finally, I'm going to put forward an idea of holding as a choreography of relationship that is what I want to call, I think, if this is the language that is most effective, is a moral relationship of care. So this is a little bit of a preview to this ambitious presentation. So to begin with, I wanted to give you in this PowerPoint, which is available to you, archived somehow, deeply embedded in the ITD conference website for your, as a kind of version of this talk, a couple of citations. So typically I try not to have very many words on any particular slide of a slide deck, but when I use the slide decks for citations, I try to have the whole thing there. So it's a kind of visual bibliography, if you will. So I wrote an article in Nouts 2012, just the other day, called The Case for Conserving Disability, in which I have made the argument for what I'm calling biodiversity conservation in relation to disability. So that's the critical background for my project here in general. I've also written another article which was put forward, I've talked about this a lot, but was put forward in a relatively short article with my colleague Lisa Izoni, who is a disabled doctor at Harvard. And that article is called Disability Cultural Competence for All as a Model. So I've been developing the concept of disability conservation and the concept of disability cultural competence, most primarily in my work over the last, few years. So some of the elements of this enterprise that I'm calling conserving disability, which draws, remember, from the concept of biodiversity conservation. So we think it's very important ethically to conserve, for example, communities that may be threatened by a variety of modernization strategies to conserve biodiversity species and to not let them become extinct. And it has been, I think, important to point out that we do not have a very robust ethical conversation or political conversation that I think is useful about conserving human biodiversity. So that's part of the larger argument I'm trying to put together. Some other points about conserving disability would be that building a sustaining environment that supports all human embodied flourishing is a goal of conserving disability. And the earlier keynote presentation by Elizabeth and Sarah, I think, really illustrated how the designed and built environment, which is something I'm going to try to return to, can sustain disability diversity, and it can also sustain all human embodied flourishing. So I want to think a lot about how the built environment and the designed environment sustains human biodiversity. Another principle of conserving disability is the idea that, again, this comes from the kind of work that Sarah and Elizabeth do, that shaping environments to fit humans rather than shaping humans to fit environments should be one of the principles that we have in our shared enterprise of world making in all of the institutions and communities in which we work. I would also like to suggest that part of conserving disability is strengthening the cultural, political, and institutional climate in which people with disabilities can most effectively flourish. I really like the word flourish, which is a word that I would never have thought about using as a literary critic or an English teacher, but when I started working in bioethics, I discovered that there was a new vocabulary, much of which is drawn from philosophy, available to me, and I think one of the most useful terms that comes from that general vocabulary is the concept and the word of human flourishing. And also, conserving disability is a way, finally, I think, to enact what I would want to call human radical equality. So equality is a element of justice. Justice is one of the pillars or one of the principles of bioethics. We can talk a little bit more about that if you're interested in the field of bioethics that I'm just barely beginning to understand. So this gives you some of the underpinnings of conserving disability as I understand it. And here are some claims that I want to carry forward in this presentation. We're going to get to the pictures here in a minute. And that is that didactic images, that is to say images that teach, images that put forward an argument about something, that make a point, often a moral point. Didactic images and narratives, and of course, narratives and images are two words to talk about a story. Images always contain a story, and I'll be looking at a lot of images with you and talking about a lot of images, but also stories, which are made up of words, are also narratives. So didactic images and narratives carry out the cultural and ethical work of representation. So I want to think a lot about this concept of the cultural and ethical work of representation, which is what people like me, who are literary scholars, if you will, or English teachers, this is what we do. We think about the meaning-making and the cultural work of representation. Representation meaning stories, images that represent our shared world and experience. And some examples of this, I've worked on this before and many other people have, of imagery or sculpture in this case is the quite well-known sculpture called Alison Lapper Pregnant by Mark Quinn, which was on display in Trafalgar Square from 2005 to 2007, and this is a marble statue of an armless and legless congenitally disabled woman who is pregnant. And it's really quite a wonderful image that brought forward questions and stories about who should reproduce in the world ethically and who does reproduce and what that reproduction might mean and be and contribute to the world. So this is part of public art that brings forward questions, ethical and moral questions about conserving disability. Another example about, I would say, about disability, but also it's not generally understood this way, and I'm giving you an example here of the really quite remarkable art by the black artist Kehinde Wiley, who paints these enormous pictures and does these enormous sculptures that represent black youths in postures and positions that are traditionally often uh, pre-modern or religious postures and choreographies. This is a really beautiful example of a kind of memorial posture of a young black contemporary man. And Wiley always uses this very, very elaborate flowered background. You may recognize his work if you have been to Washington, D.C. and seen the official portrait of Barack Obama, which is what he did with the flowers in the background. It's really worth a pilgrimage if you get that opportunity. Some other example of art, of image making that does work in the world. Just some examples here. I have a wooden statue, and I don't have the information on this from the National Museum of Art in Warsaw, which I took this myself, where we have a statue of Jesus pointing at the wound in his side, suggesting, again, through this choreography, bodily choreography, a story, a didactic story, and this is, of course, the story of the Christian story of the crucifixion, and inevitably, of course, the resurrection. In contrast to that, another portrait. This is a self-portrait by the disabled artist, Riva Lehrer. I'd highly recommend you're going and looking at her work. It's really quite interesting. This is a self-portrait. I would call it a baptismal self-portrait, in which she's in a pond of water with a gold scarf wrapped around her, and she's displaying her back in the same way that we have Jesus displaying the wounded body. She is displaying the wounded body of someone who was born with spina bifida and has lived a life as a person with a disability as a result. Another story that I wanted to mention here that is quite remarkable is the story that is told of the Bible. This is the New Testament and Acts, which is in a book that is here somewhere, right, Devin? And that we might be able to somehow go and see the St. John's Bible here. It's really quite a beautiful thing. It's an illuminated manuscript that is done by a team of calligraphers, and it was completed in 2011. So I don't know about you, but when I go to Washington, D.C., I always make a pilgrimage to the Library of Congress to see the Gutenberg Bible. And now I try to make a pilgrimage wherever I go to see a St. John's Bible, if there is one in residence at the place. It comes from St. John's University. So if you ever have the opportunity to see it, it's really quite a beautiful thing. So again, these are stories that are illustrated with words and with images that do didactic moral work in the world. I want to suggest that critical design claims or asserts, critical design is the area that Elizabeth and Sarah work in, that critical design asserts that the designed and built world that we inhabit together shapes the community of humans who inhabit it. In other words, that there's a reciprocal relationship between human communities and what they build, and the built environment and how that built environment shapes the community of humans that inhabit it. And that relationship of making is what I want to talk about in relation to Foundling wheels today, and I'll tell you more about Foundling wheels. An example of how art can shape a community. I have lots of examples. This is something I'm quite fascinated with, and that is the story that is told in the Eisenheim altarpiece, which is in Colmar, France, which is a presentation in the altarpiece of a story, and it is the story of the crucifixion and the involvement of caregivers in this scene of dying and death that is so central to the Christian narratives of what it means to be human. And what I find really interesting here is that we have a figure who is basically a nun in this scene. She's to the left of the crucified Christ, and she's being held up. This is actually Mary. It's a version of Mary, and I'll talk more about that, who is dressed very much like we would think of as a nun today. And this altar piece will foreshadow a little bit what I'm going to be talking about. But it's a very beautiful altar piece with 4 sections that depict the crucifixion. And I would also suggest that, of course, whenever we, as disability theologians, see an image of the crucifixion, I think it calls up, and I don't have an image of this, Nancy Easland's wonderful book, The Disabled God, which is, I think, a founding text of disability theology. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about Foundling wheels, and I'll begin with this engraving from 1753 of the London Foundling Hospital, which is now demolished. It was a very large hospital with a courtyard and a gate, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. It was the location of the first performance, well, it was the second performance, but the first performance in England, of Handel's Messiah. And it was presented as basically the first charity event, the first fundraising event of that era in 1750. And this engraving is from 1753. And the problem that existed in London, which was an enormous city, in the mid-18th century, and no one knew how that many people could live together effectively. And one of the biggest social and ethical and medical problems was abandoned children. So children were left everywhere in the street, on the street corners. They were thrown in the river. There was a huge population of abandoned children and babies. And so the London Foundling Hospital was built as an orphanage, basically. And it was supposed to be for children under the age of 3 years old, or maybe it was even younger than that, I'm not exactly sure, but you could easily find this out. And they were overwhelmed immediately when the hospital was built. They called it a hospital, but it was really an orphanage. They were overwhelmed with the number of children that were brought up to the age of 15 or 16. And many of those children, of course, lived out their whole lives in the London Foundling Hospital. The mortality rate there, meaning the number of people who died under the age of 15, was 2/3. Now, the infant mortality rate, which is to say people who die under the age of 15, that's what infancy is considered, worldwide has always been around 25%. But it's not that high, of course, in places like the United States and other countries like this. But worldwide, generally, the infant mortality rate has been, over time, about 25%. But at the London Foundling Hospital, it was as high as 2/3. But nonetheless, the other third lived and existed and went off into the world. So to talk again about the designed and built environment, I want to return to that constantly because that's the background here to what I'm going to do with Foundling Wheels. I wanted to show you that part of the designed and built environment that does didactic work is not just pictures like Kehinde Wiley's, but more routine or routinized kinds of images. And of course, there's nothing more important than that, than the International Symbol of Access, which we have 2 images here. They're familiar to almost all of us from 1968. The more the stick figure, the blue stick figure of the wheelchair user, the stylized stick figure that is on the white background, and the more recent, more dynamic, and also, of course, controversial figure that Sarah Hendren and others have designed from 2010 with the wheelchair user that suggests the kind of agency that the disability rights and disability laws that we have developed worldwide, actually, and the disability rights movement has given us a new understanding of what it might mean to be disabled and to be in the world. And I think these two emblems emblematize, if you will, that change in the way that people with disabilities can be in the world as a result of the human and civil rights movement and the legislation and changes in the world from that. So these are, again, part of the didactic imagery of disability conservation. Perhaps the most important emblem, of course, of the welcoming, if you will, from the designed and built environment to people with disabilities in the world is the ramp, which of course goes together with the image of the wheelchair. And this is a particularly beautiful ramp. It is from the Ed Roberts, and we heard a little bit about Ed Roberts earlier today, the Ed Roberts Center, or campus in Berkeley, California. It is a bright red ramp that is in the very center of the building. It is the center of interest at the building. And of course, many of us are aware that when the ramping of the world began in the late 1960s, ramps were thought to be aesthetic blots on buildings. They were understood as ugly. They were understood as devaluing a building, but making it accessible to people with disabilities. And over the decades, since the early 1960s, what we have is that the ramp has come from being something that was bolted on to the front of buildings to something that is now essential to the very, very core and center of a building. And this Ed Roberts ramp illustrates that quite beautifully. So, Foundling wheels. I'm going to talk a little bit about them now and the concept of holding. I'll come back to this, but for now, a foundling wheel, which is sometimes more recently called a baby box or a baby hatch, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, was a revolving crib that was set most usually in the wall of a church or of a convent, but also other places. I don't think the London Foundling Hospital had a foundling wheel in it. I think the babies were simply brought into the hospital. But convents and churches often had foundling wheels. And these date from the Middle Ages up until now, and we'll look at some of images of those, in which which allowed an abandoned baby or an unwanted baby to be left anonymously and safely. Now, we can talk more about this later, but now all 50 states in the United States have what are called safe haven policies or laws, which have some process, if you will, for placement of a baby or a child. Often these are at fire stations or police stations where there is a procedure in place to receive a child or a baby, and they vary a great deal from state to state, but every state has a safe haven practice or law of some kind. Anyway, so these, as I said, architectural features that began in the Middle Ages, we'll look at a few of these, were built into care homes, they were built into convents, religious buildings, hospitals, and other buildings. And my point is, and I'll say this again, these architectural features, foundling wheels, I really think it's very poetic, testify to a social and a moral commitment to care for supposedly unwanted children. And that's what I want to think about here as the moral work, if you will, of foundling wheels, and to think about foundling wheels as a metaphor for a kind of moral work that we collectively may wish to undertake in one way or another. And I want to suggest that the foundling wheel, and I'll say this again, is an historic metaphor for an alternative understanding and practice to selective termination on the basis of disability. So we can talk more about this. But as a bioethicist, one of the areas that I work in is the development. I don't have any influence, don't misunderstand me, but the conversations, being involved in conversations about the development of genetic testing and thus the development and practice of different forms of termination under different logics on the basis of the detection or the prediction in some ways of a risk for disability. And that's another issue that we can talk about more fully if you would like to, but that's an area that I have contributed somewhat to in bioethics, and many other people have done this as well. Okay, so I'm showing you some images now, and I'll describe them of some foundling wheels. This is from 1830. It's an infant is placed into the tour, capital T-O-U-R, which apparently was one of the words in French that is used for the foundling wheel. They are a lot like you may be familiar with when you go to the library and you want to return your books and the library's closed. You pull the door down and you put the book in and you close it and the book goes into the library. That's basically the same principle. This illustration shows a couple, apparently a woman holding a baby, and there's a foundling wheel or a baby box that is in the wall of something here, because of course many of the medieval cities or 18th century or 17th century cities had or 19th century cities in this case, I'm sorry, had walls, lots of walls. And so it looks like the mother who's down on her knees is going to put the baby in the foundling wheel, and the man accompanying her is looking around to be on guard in some ways. And then the second section of this illustration, which has a Gothic frame around it, each of these pictures, which is really quite interesting. We see the inside of the convent where the baby has been received. And the woman, before she puts the baby in one of the illustrations, looks quite distressed. And inside, the baby is received by a group of 4 women who appear to be nuns, and they are prepared. They have opened the foundling wheel, have taken the baby out, and they are holding the baby. So this is, again, a didactic story told with pictures about what a foundling wheel can do for a parent or a woman who is unable or unwilling to keep a baby and to put this baby into the hands, literally, of people who are in a position to be able to care for it effectively. So here are some pictures of some foundling wheels. This is one from Italy. Maybe you've traveled in Europe and seen these kinds of things. They're hard to recognize if you don't know actually what they are. There are a few other images that I don't have in here that I want to add, but this is a picture of, literally, it looks like a wheel, almost like a millstone with a little window in it where apparently one puts the baby, then turns it, and there's wood all the way around the edges of it. Again, I don't know a lot. I have to do a little bit more research. Maybe I'll get to go to Italy and take a look at these things a little bit more closely. I have seen one before in the wall of a convent that had been turned into a restaurant, and I think it was in South Africa, but I'm not sure quite where it was. But it was a long time ago. Another foundling wheel in the French countryside. Again, this looks like a big barrel that just turns, and the baby goes in, and then it's turned. Oftentimes there was a bell. I'm wanting to see now. I'm not finding that. The one I saw, there was a bell right next to the wheel, and you put the baby in and ring the bell so that the nuns would understand that there was a baby there, and then they would come and get the baby. So, although I didn't find a picture like that, but I'm still looking if anybody finds anything. So I want to suggest, this is my definition of a foundling wheel, that a foundling wheels are aesthetic objects that are visual narratives about human diversity, solidarity, and the human need for care. In other words, it's a story. The story of a baby, like I showed you in the illustration, of a baby that cannot be cared for properly, that is perhaps unwanted, to be moved into a different environment where that baby or that child can be effectively cared for. And I want to think about that transfer as a metaphor, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And I want to talk a bit about care ethics, so I'm just going to offer a very brief definition. I've been reading Keith Dow's book, Formed Together, which is about care and care ethics, and so I would want to redo my definition here of care ethics to be inflected by Keith's work on care, but I haven't had time to do that yet. This is a definition of care and care ethics that comes primarily from Jackie Leach Scully, who has written a book called Disability Bioethics. And there are a few other feminist bioethicists who have been participating in that. Eva Katay, for example, if you're familiar with her work. And so the claims of care ethics would be that care ethics asserts that there is a moral significance in the fundamental elements of relationships and dependencies in human life. And so that this idea of care ethics is often understood in contradistinction to an individualist or sometimes a transhumanist understanding of human persons as independent of care and the need for care independent of one another. So that individualistic conception of what a human person might be is countered by the idea of the human person in need of care and entangled in relations of dependency and care throughout life. And this is a very important understanding, certainly for disability bioethics, disability studies, and disability theology. So there's much to be said about care and theorizing care that we could do together. So I want to suggest, again, I said this, but that foundling wheels are, I want to say, didactic, that is, they're stories with a message, a moral message, and functional technologies. So they're didactic technologies and they're functional technologies that support care ethics. And my term that I want to offer is that foundling wheels are ramps to life. So I want to think about them as designed and built technologies that are ramps in some ways. In other words, you go from A to B in a foundling wheel, from one environment to another environment that provides an environment that will care and sustain life. So I'm thinking about them, and this is important to understand in this project, and you can help me out, as metaphors for what we may want to think through is a different understanding from the understanding that often is put forward about the idea of unwanted or untenable human lives. So again, here's some more pictures, a repetition. Foundling wheels are architectural features. This is my thesis. Often in convents that are historical metaphors that offer an alternative reproductive practice to selective termination based on disability risk. And of course, foundling wheels were not used specifically for children that were unwanted on the basis of disability, but often that was part of the logic of the rejection of these children or the unsustainability of them. So this is a foundling wheel in Rome, which is really quite beautiful. and it has a frame and a grate over the front. It looks a little bit like a beautiful return air vent in a wonderful house. And I'm not sure exactly how these worked, but I presume that there was some information that was put forward on the side of this Foundling wheel, which is in, again, the wall of something. There appears to be a small slot where some information, maybe a paper or something, could be inserted to accompany the child. Again, I haven't had a chance to do a lot of research on the actual configurations of these or how they were actually used. Again, I suggested that Foundling wheels, and this is my thesis, are historical metaphors that might change the story of children considered unwanted or abandoned. I was at a conference recently trying to present some of this material, and I apparently said, I didn't realize I said it until someone said, this is what she said, and that is that what I was after is that I didn't want to change the law, I wanted to change the story. And I thought, that's what I want to capture, that I'm interested in changing the story, because of course stories is what English teachers traffic in. So this is what I'm trying to do in looking at these architectural features of the designed and built world together, and to think about a different story. So again, I want to retrieve the architectural history of Foundling wheels to offer a conceptual alternative reproductive practice to termination of unsustainable life, same picture. And I'll show you some modern baby boxes is what they're called sometimes, or I think that's what they're called, it's just baby boxes here in the United States. This is one in Florida. There are a few baby boxes, mostly in the U.S. South, and these, of course, have, they are incubators. So they are warmed, and they have, they have all sorts of, the baby goes basically directly into an incubator that will care for it. And there are all sorts of different apparatuses of information and anonymity that go along with these. They're very controversial, but they're used very infrequently. I think only 2 or 3 times. Just recently, there was an article in the newspaper about a baby that was left. So they're there, but they're not used very much for a bunch of, I'm sure, complicated reasons. This is another photograph. The outside of the baby box, there's a picture on the left. It's called the Indiana Safe Haven Baby Box, and it's a box in the wall with instructions and a safe haven crisis line where someone can call. And then from the inside, what we see is this kind of incubator-looking thing that's heated. And it says every baby gets a home. It's a fire department, apparently. And there is a changing table with toys and diapers and apparently some sort of apparatus for caring for the child that might be left. So, again, I haven't done a lot of this. Internationally, there are a number of baby boxes. This is a photograph of a university hospital in Japan from 2022. This is a baby hatch where, again, there's a sliding door and the baby is deposited in there in some way. Again, this is only a photograph. I don't have a lot of information about how these actually work or how often they're used, but internationally, this is one in Japan from 2022. I also saw some photographs of baby boxes in India, so they're used in other countries, perhaps more than they are in the United States. So I want to say, I'm going to try to finish up here quickly, that Foundling wheels, as I've suggested, are technologies of holding. And I want to think about the idea of holding as a choreography, a relational choreography, embodied relationship of engagement and touching between humans that is an affirmation of connection and an affirmation of life. Holding is also a welcome, and holding is a form of care. And again, this is, I'm trying to lay out a philosophical definition of holding that I take in part from some of my own work on beholding, but I want to think, as I've said, about holding as an affirmation, holding as a welcome, holding as care, and I'll show you a little bit more about this. And I take part of this from an early piece that Hannah Arendt writes called I Want You to Be, which is a calling forward of another, an affirmation, a welcoming of another, which I find to be quite productive. I also use a lot of what Hannah Arendt does in The Human Condition about what she calls natality as the fundamental connection between all people. Everyone experiences natality is what Arendt says in The Human Condition, but more of that later. And really what I want to show you is the emblem of holding that has come to me from ITD, and that is when I went last year to my first conference. I sat on the porch, and a lovely woman who knitted during all of the sessions, and I began to talk, and I said, "What are you knitting?" And she said, "I knit," and we got to talking. And she said to me on the second or third day of our talking in the porch, she said, "Do you have any mittens?" And I said, "Of course I don't have mittens, because I have very unusual hands. I don't want to ever say only. I have 6 fingers. Most people have 10. And my hands are not symmetrical." And I said, "Of course I don't have any mittens." And she said, "I'm going to knit you some mittens." And so we spent time together. She traced my hands. She measured my hands. It was a little uncomfortable because the last thing I want to do is to call any attention to my hands. In fact, that's one reason I talk so much. It's like, look at my mouth, not my hands, you guys. But anyway, in a few months, Jasmine Duckworth sent me these beautiful mittens that are knitted with very fine weave or fine, yarn. I don't know about anything but knitting. Mittens. She said, "What color do you want them to be? What do you want them to be made out of?" And I said, I'm very sophisticated. I live in the city, so I need them to be gray and black. And she said, "Fine." And so she sent me these beautiful mittens that are bespoke in the sense that they're designed for me. They're asymmetrical. They're gray with a black band around the top and a beautiful kind of pattern. I don't know what to say, little curlicue kind of pattern. And the right hand has the spaces for the 4 fingers that I have. I have mittens that are the kind that 2-year-olds wear, that you put them on and you can't do anything. But now I have real mittens. And then the other one, my left hand, I have 2 fingers, and they're unusually shaped. And, there's my hands in those mittens. So I think that this is a really important emblem of holding and friendship that comes from ITD, of welcoming from the community that you've constituted here, and I want you to know about that here. So this is really the most important image in the whole presentation. So I'm going to end very briefly with a project that I've been working on. I've published a tiny little thin thing about this somewhere, but I'm working on the choreography, the sacred choreography, Marian imagery of sacred choreographies. I'm particularly interested in the Pietà, which of course the most well-known Pietà is in the Vatican, in St. Peter's Basilica, and it's Michelangelo's Pietà, which of course is the choreography of holding, of the mother holding the dead son on her lap. It's a very beautiful image of holding. It's generally thought of as a lamentation scene, but I like to think of it as a scene of care, a scene of bodily care, because of course women are always charged throughout all of history with the care of the body at the beginning of life, the care of body at the end of life, of bodies at the end of life. So this is Michelangelo's Pietà. I'll just be brief about this. This is another Pietà. There are many, many Pietàs that have been created as allusions, A-L-L-U-S-I-O-N-S, to the Michelangelo's Pietà. This is 2007. It's called Pietà, or Still Life, by the Australian artist, realistic artist, Sam Jinks. Go to this website. The stuff is remarkable. And we have this rewritten Pietà that I think is very moving. So instead of the mother, we have a man, a rather common-looking man, who is holding on his lap an old person. So not a child or a son or a young person, but a very old person. So you have a kind of reversal here, if one would imagine maybe this as the father and the son. It can be read in a variety of ways. But it's a very moving image, which of course gains its authority and meaning because it is the same choreography of embodied holding that we have in the famous Christian Pietà in the Vatican. And there are many Pietàs. I'll share a few of them. This is a 2018 Pietà by Tylon Sawyer. And this is an American flag in the background. This is a painting, and there is a mother figure or a woman figure who not is looking down on the child on her lap, but rather is looking straight out in a gaze of accusation, I think. A black woman looking out onto the audience, and on her lap, she's draped with a white gown of some kind, and on her lap is a young, probably black or brown boy with a hoodie, who is on her lap. And so again, we have that same choreography of holding, choreography of perhaps lament, or choreography of celebration of care, depending on how you want to read it. But there are a number of these. I'll show you a few other of these choreographies. I'm particularly taken by this one, which is a different kind of Pietà. I'm reading it as a Pietà. It's a photograph from 1987 by the American photographer Robert Andy Coombs. It's a self-portrait. Coombs is a man he's a white man, very white in this photograph. He's lying on a couch. It's called Cuddle on Couch, which I think is, I don't know, a bit of a trivializing portrait, but it's really quite beautiful. And he's being embraced by another person, which I think we want to read as a man, who is a dark-skinned person. So you have a really interesting contrast, not the contrast of a gender contrast of males and females like you would in Michelangelo's Pietà, but here you have a contrast of the holder and the person being held, is a contrast of skin tone. And the very center of interest in this nude Pietà, which is not how we typically see Pietàs, is, and I don't know what to call this, maybe someone can help with this. It's a tube that goes into his abdomen. Say that again? Suprapubic. There's a suprapubic tube going into his abdomen, and then he has a leg bag that comes from apparently having a catheter. So it's this is in some ways, the David in Florence as well, in a different posture. And it's a very, I think, a very moving version of holding and what holding might mean. And again, what I think is interesting is that the medical markings of disability are at the very center of interest here in this really interesting photographic self-portrait. I wanted to show a couple of other images just briefly that have to do with various choreographies of holding. Sarah mentioned Alice Shepard and Laurel Lawson and the ramp, and this is a photograph of the two of them in a choreography of holding, where they are holding one another and their wheelchairs are holding one another in the virtuosity of performance that they put forward using Sarah's ramp in a performance called Kinetic Light from 2017. It's really quite a beautiful scene of, they have outstretched arms, almost bird-like, and they are gesturing toward one another in this choreography of holding with wheelchairs. This is another holding image that I find very moving that comes again from disability art and disability culture. This is the artist Judith Scott, 1943 to 2005, who is a very well-known American sculptor. Judith Scott began sculpting in Berkeley, California, at a kind of sheltered workshop for people with disabilities that had some craft equipment. And she began rapping and rapping and rapping and continued rapping for decades. And her work is quite well recognized. She is a woman with Down syndrome and autism who never spoke. And she simply made art. This is a very well-known black and white photograph of Judith Scott embracing one of her sculptures. So she has her arms wrapped around this sculpture, which is egg-like in some way. It looks as if it's simply wrapped and wrapped and wrapped. It's as big as she is, and she is embracing it and appears to actually be putting her face up against it in a very tender embrace between the artist and the artwork. This is another choreography of holding that I find very moving. This is a photograph that was taken of my colleague and friend Haben Girma with Barack Obama in 2015 at a celebration at the White House that we all got to go to for the celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And Haben is the first, get this, the first deaf-blind person to ever graduate from Harvard Law School. And when I met Haben, I thought, whoever thought of this? She's an unimaginable figure in the world, and she's quite a public figure now. And she was recruited, those of us who were working on this, recruited Haben as the perfect person to introduce Barack Obama. They actually resemble one another somewhat. She is second generation African American from Eritrean heritage. And so they actually look a little bit alike. And what was interesting to me is Haben has this whole apparatus of stuff. She has a dog, she has microphones, she's got a Braille typewriter that she uses to get on in the world. And when she was communicating with President Obama, what was clear to me, looking at his face, is that he had never imagined anyone like Haben Girma in the world. And I thought the work of her presence there was extremely important. And so someone took this beautiful photograph of him embracing her, holding her. He's got his arm around her and his hand on her shoulder, and he's holding her hand. And they're walking through the White House reception together. It's a very moving photograph, in my view, of holding. And I noticed later that Joe Biden's in the background. So it's a great picture. I think well, we've got another minute or two. Okay. See, I told you I'm too much. Just ask my family. I wanted to point out that this is an image of holding I'm particularly interested in. This was the cover story on The Atlantic, December 2020. Look at it if you haven't had a chance to look at it. It's by Sarah Zhang. It's called The Last Children of Down Syndrome, in which Sarah Zhang interviewed people in Denmark who have Down syndrome and the families of people with Down syndrome in Denmark to see what life is like for them after Denmark, as well as a few other Nordic nations, announced that they had eliminated Down syndrome. And it's a really good article. Sarah Zhang called me up, and as well as a few other people, and asked us to make comments. So she really did good research, and it's a very beautiful cover. So we have a little girl, cute little girl, one of the ones that she features in her story, who has Down syndrome, and someone has, this is an adult, hand, maybe a man's hand, that is placed in a gesture I would like to read of blessing on the top of this young girl with her little golden braids on top of her head. And it's a very, I think, a very powerful photograph that advocates for this group of people who are endangered human species. Some other holding images that I have worked with. This is a very famous picture of a woman from 1972 in Japan holding a person with a disability. I'm not sure who that person is, but it's a very beautiful image of beholding and holding at the same time, in the way that the woman is regarding the face of the young person that she is holding in the bath. And this is, there's a whole iconography of people holding people in baths. This is a photograph by Mary Ellen Marks. It's a black and white photograph from 2006 of a rehabilitation pool in Iceland where a woman is holding a young girl, perhaps a young girl with a disability, with the same look of regard on her face. And I want to suggest that this choreography of looking in these holding postures or scenes of holding, which are rather baptismal because, of course, they're in water, but they also suggest the really important philosophical position or philosophical work of Emmanuel Levinas about regarding the face of the other. So there's a lot of allusion to philosophical traditions of bodily choreographies and bodily relationships that we can find in some of these photographs of holding. I just want to wrap up with one choreography of care that I haven't done too much with, but I'm thinking that I'd like to do more with this. This is a picture from 1487 to 1490 by Hans Memling. I don't know who that is, but there are a lot of these. This is a Marian image. This is the virgin suckling the child. There are a lot of these images of the Madonna and child, but it's a very particular image, and that is what they call Maria Lactans, which is to say the nursing Madonna. I think I might have another one. Yeah, here's another one in which we have the whole Holy Family from 1550, and in the center is, of course, Mary holding the baby Jesus, but in this case, this is the Maria Lactans tradition. She's nursing the baby at the same time. So I think that that's a very interesting choreography of care, bodily care, that can be put in conversation with the Pietà as a choreography of bodily care. And that's as far as I've got. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to have comments and questions. I think we have a few more minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosemarie. I'm going to just take the first question, if you don't mind. I'm thinking about the juxtaposition of so many of those images of a person holding another person and how different they feel to me than a box holding a baby. And it made me think about boxes that hold babies, and I could think of three. So what I immediately thought, because I thought, oh, they're heated, that makes a lot of sense. A NICU bed looks a lot like that too. And these are not unwanted children. I think we should think about that word. I'm not sure that everybody who would put their child in a foundling wheel would be an unwanted child. But often in the NICU, these are babies in boxes who are very much wanted, right? So they're so wanted that we would put them in a box because that's the safest place to put them. And how you juxtapose that with a foundling box. And then a coffin. I was recently visiting a historic mansion, and at the entryway there were two children. And at first I thought they were sleeping, but of course then you realize they're dead. And they had created these monuments in coffins of the children. And so that would be the third box of the perhaps wanted, perhaps unwanted child that the child would be held in. And so I'm thinking about the three boxes in which our children might be held. And the blurring of wanted, unwanted becomes messy. And I just want to think about that with you.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Devin. I was using the term perhaps recklessly unwanted because that's part of the vocabulary
It is, yeah.
of babies that are not kept, let me say.
It's how the law describes safe haven, too, as
Right,
unwanted.
exactly. I thought it was interesting when Sarah was talking in her presentation, didn't you say you got your baby, you got your boy, Graham, and didn't you say that was a baby no one wanted? Yeah. Yeah. So that vocabulary is worth really looking at a lot, but thank you so much. Of course, there's so much Victorian imagery about dead children, because of course the death rate for children was so, as I mentioned, high. And of course, especially death was part of Victoriana. And the sentimentality of death was raised narratively and visually in Victorian culture to a very high level. But thank you for suggesting that. Yeah. I hadn't thought about the coffins.
Yeah, Bill.
I couldn't help but remember one story, just a brief comment, then I want to make another question, really. But a long time ago, when I was a chaplain in one of the old hellhole institutions, there was a time when they were trying to say that adults with intellectual disabilities, and this was a woman who really wasn't that much intellectually disabled, in her midlife in a long stretcher bed, who always held a doll. And around the time of normalization, then people started saying, you can't do that because you're making them childish. And I remember one day talking to Barbara, and she loved to be talked with and kidded with and stuff, just had the greatest laugh. And I said, why do you do that? Why do you hold the baby doll? Not trying to take it away or anything. She said, well, if I didn't, my arms would be empty. And which just always said, something to me about that.
That says a lot.
And your image about the Foundling box compared to as an alternative to termination, which is in termination, the story ends. The Foundling box, one story ends, another story begins. So I wonder how you might see that metaphor becoming a, system of care or options of care in the world. I just wondered if you've taken that and played
that's
with
why
it.
I wanted to stress that I'm actually using the Foundling wheel as a metaphor for a way to think about how we might, that's why I liked the idea of a ramp, to think of it as a ramp from one caretaker to another caretaker. And to imagine social and material apparatuses that might make that more possible and more tenable. And to point out that historically, human cultures have been doing this forever. So that we might be able to think that there's a precedent for this.
So did Jacob have a ladder or?
It's a perilous thing I'm doing here, you understand.
Thank you so much, Rosemarie. I was also thinking about this sort of Foundling wheel as an alternative, and the stories to selective termination and the stories that get us to these two options. And I had a case as a clinical ethicist where the story was that this child with Down syndrome had such a poor quality of life that termination for these parents was the only option, and medical foster care was offered to them. And they refused because they had it in their mind that the quality of life was so bad that it would not be a good story. So how do we reframe the story so that Foundling Wheels, or this idea of transitioning to other caretakers, can actually happen?
Well, that's my point. How can we reframe? How can we change the story? Yeah.
Just told that we actually, the next thing happens at 4:45.
Oh.
And so we need to transition, but Keith wanted to just read a couple comments online and make them as comments maybe rather than questions. And I'm sorry, Greg. So hopefully people can catch you in the in-between time.
Oh, absolutely. I'm
Okay.
happy to be available. And thank you for your patience.
Yeah, so I just wanted to highlight a couple of things from online that people are very appreciative. So Naomi Jacobs says, fascinating presentation, thanks to you. Tom says, this presentation has been so insightful and creative. I'll be thinking about these themes for some time to come. And then Aaron Rafferty as well has put an interesting comment in the chat that's worth thinking about the relationship with what happens after the holding, right? So she raises the question of disabled children in China and what happens through the adoption process and some of the complexities of care and ethics. Kind of post that, and I'm summarizing Erin, so hopefully, so she might contact you by email just to follow up that way, but thank you so much.
I should say one thing that is an important clarification that I haven't quite worked out is I'm using the term selective termination, which is a medical description, and in medicine in general, there's a distinction between termination, which is what abortion is, but I think the word termination is much more descriptive for what's happening. But in some ways, selective termination means to terminate a pregnancy on the basis of some information. So you're selecting to terminate for a reason, which is usually a diagnosis or a risk profile for disability condition, and that's very controversial. But I also would want to expand this ethically and suggest that all terminations are selective in some ways, and I would want to develop that a little bit more fully.